Okay, we're kind of starting something new, but in a way it isn't, because it's kind of a continuation of what we've been looking at, and some of the things theologically are going to be very, very similar as we move from the books of the Kings to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's what we're going to do now. Now, just so that we get where we are, a sense of where we are as we're entering Ezra. What is the condition? What condition did we leave Judah when we tied up 2 Kings? What was the situation?
It's in captivity.
Okay, Judah's in captivity. Who made them captives?
Cyrus. Was it Cyrus?
Well, it wasn't Cyrus. Who was it? Babylonians. The Nebuchadnezzar Babylonians conquer Jerusalem, take the people in Judah, or the leadership in Judah, into captivity. Why did Judah fall? I mean, they fell to Nebuchadnezzar, global empire, an empire strong enough that they could defeat the Egyptians, not only the Assyrians, but the Egyptians. Why did little bitty Judah fall?
Egypt wouldn't help him.
God. Yeah, you're politically, militarily, you're right. From the perspective of the writer of 2 Kings, there's only one answer. God. Why did they fall? God. Well, why would God cause them to fall? What is it that caused that to happen? Caused God to be motivated?
They weren't listening.
Okay, they weren't listening. And in particular, how weren't they listening?
They broke the covenant.
Okay, they broke the covenant. And from the perspective of the writer of 2 Kings, what seemed to be not only the basis for the covenant, but almost the whole shooting match. Because he really doesn't talk about much else. What is the side, because covenants are contract, God's going to protect his people, be there, guide them, direct them, yada, yada, yada. What is the expectation God has of his people? They're going to worship. They're going to worship him right. And what is worshiping God right?
The temple.
You got to worship in the temple in Jerusalem. You got to do the sacrifices the way they're supposed to. Ideally, celebrate all the special days. It's worship. That's what the writer seems to see. I mean, he never talks about, when you think of the covenant, and good gracious, 10 Commandments. You know, the 10 Commandments don't have to do with, well, commandment number 1, you have to sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. Number 2, you can only use, pure sheep. I mean, that's not the 10 Commandments. I mean, they have to do with living in community, not killing, not cheating, not lying, that kind of jazz. And that's not even mentioned, in 2 Kings, that's what they were doing wrong. It's purely worship. And that's the perspective of the writer. And that perspective is really interesting. It's going to carry over into Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, just sort of as a little aside, why might that be an ancient perspective? Certainly it is this perspective here, but why might it be characteristic of an ancient perspective? And I'll tell you, I think it's also what early Christians kind of felt as the church was developing after, it was more established. I'm not talking about the church in the 1st and 2nd century, but I'm talking about the church as we move into the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. Why does worship become so very important? As sort of even more, worship is more important than how you treat your neighbor. That's less important than performing a sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem.
Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind,
Sure.
and soul, and thou shalt never have another God before them.
Why is that more important than going out and killing your neighbor?
Because that's what God expects. That was
In the ancient world, why might that be? And we're even talking about, you got to worship here. You can't worship there. That's wrong. You worship here. How do you do it? This is how you do it. Well, what if I do it this way? Nope, that's wrong. You got to do it this way. Why is that so important?
God was in the temple.
Well, that's what they believe. God is in the temple. Why would that be? In an ancient world, now think about living in an ancient world, way different than our world. Way different. Why would the ritual of worship, the rituals you follow in worship, be so crucially important? We wouldn't look at it and say, oh yeah, if we're not doing it this way, boy, we're not worshiping God, and God's going to come down on us.
Is it because God told them how to build the temple and that he was going to be in the temple and God directed them?
Right. Now, what you're doing is right.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, you're taking a theological perspective. I'm looking at a more practical. Why would an ancient person across religions? Because like I said, Christians are going to do the same thing. Christians were going to do the exact same thing in the 5th century, AD. Why is, in fact, we're going to do that probably until somewhere around the 16th century. Why? Why would ancient people, even medieval people, why would the rituals of worship be so crucially important?
Because it's what God set up.
Well, again, you're right, that's theological. I'm talking about in practical terms.
Spit it out, we don't know.
What's that?
Nothing's written down.
Yes, that's it. You don't have anything written down. Therefore, the only thing you've got is what? Rituals that you follow. You're talking about a pre-literate people, even if you had stuff written down. People couldn't read it. Because, remember, writing something down was incredibly expensive, and the only way you could do it is by hanging. So you couldn't, people didn't have a book in every house. Couldn't do it.
Word of mouth.
Yeah, that's right. Therefore, the only thing you've got in terms of relating to God are the rituals that you're taught to follow. We have a hard time putting ourselves back, and that sort of was evidence that we have a hard time putting ourselves back into that world because one, we've got so much written. And it's getting easier and easier and easier to read and present it. You don't even need to know how to read because you can have somebody read it to you or see videos of it. So this is so easy to communicate information. In the ancient world, it wasn't. It was really, really hard. And people didn't read because there wasn't anything to read. I mean, they were stupid. They were good in math. They were really good because you had to know how to do that. Because that was every day. But you didn't have anything to read, therefore reading wasn't important.
And they didn't have a radio or TV.
They didn't have radio, they didn't have television, they didn't have books, they had nothing. Except somebody to teach them the rituals. Someone to teach them this is the way you relate to God. And that's, Protestants, we have a hard time, we sometimes struggle when we look at our Roman Catholic friends. With all their rituals, and you say, oh, geez, what do you have to do? All these. I talked to a woman the other day whose daughter can't be the godmother of her sister's child, because she's married but wasn't married in the church, and therefore she's committing adultery because she hasn't performed the. Not even adultery, it's more like fornication, because it's not even, neither one are married. They're not married. Therefore, she can't represent God at the baptism. We'd say, oh, well, that's horrible, terrible. Well, when Roman Catholicism grew up, people couldn't read it. That's the only way that you could know about God, is there are certain things you follow. Do you know why you follow them? Heck no. But you do. Because that's how you associate with God. And that's the people we're working with here. So it's really tempting, it has been tempting a lot of times for me to look at this and say, boy, their priorities are sure wrong. Instead of talking about how you treat one another and having a society that loves God and loves neighbor, like Jesus said, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with loving neighbor. Well, we're talking about an ancient people that look at the world and God because of their situation different than we do. And I guess the maybe an exciting news is I will guarantee you in 1,000 years, people are going to be looking at us and saying, how could they do that? How could they be doing that? Yeah, because, geez, what were they thinking? Because the world is constantly changing, people constantly change. So anyway, that's the perspective here. And so as we move in, the people have been taken into exile because the covenant with God is broken and God withdrew his protection, which remember goes all the way back to Genesis when God creates this bubble in the water that he calls the heavens and the earth, with water all around it, chaos all around it. He offered that protection. He withdraws his protection. And the Babylonians take charge. And what do the Babylonians end up doing to the people?
Making them slaves.
Or take them to another place. And what was the philosophy behind moving the population to another place? What was the idea? Why would the Babylonians do that?
To break up their strength.
Yeah, it minimizes their strength, right? Because if you leave leaders in their country, leaders may rebel. They may lead. And that's going to be a problem for the Babylonians, and the Assyrians had the same idea. So instead of having to deal with that, you just take the leaders out of one place, move them to another, and take people from another place and move them in. To varying degrees, empires have always done that. Move people around to break bases of power because it's easier to control people, and that's what you want. You want as little problem as you can have. So the leadership, the wealthiest, the most well-equipped, the religious establishment was shipped somewhere else, was moved somewhere else. And what would their perspective have been being moved away? What would you expect their perspective to be?
You felt like slaves?
Well, they might see themselves as slaves, whether they were or not might be open, because remember they were moved to a place whose leadership was moved someplace else, and the Babylonians would have been delighted for those Jewish leaders to take leadership roles in another part of the empire, because they sure aren't going to lead this to rebel. They'll be beholden to the Babylonians. So you've got the best equipped people here, but some may see themselves as slaves because God's, not God, but the Babylonians have taken them out of their land. Okay, so if they see themselves as oppressed or slaves, what might that cause them to be thinking? How would it have affected their thought as they looked forward?
They would adopt whatever community they were in. They would adopt their
Okay,
beliefs.
good. That's a real possibility, that they could be moved here and they could start adopting what the people there believed. Now, since the Babylonians are moving people around, and so are the Assyrians, they're moving people around, who would be most susceptible to making that kind of change? The people who were the leaders here, the religious and political leaders here, or the lower class folks, the less educated? Okay, maybe the less educated would be most susceptible to just buying in to the culture, but that's certainly involved people buying into the culture. Might some have just the opposite reaction? Yeah, well, of course, since I asked the question, clearly that's what I wanted. So thank you, Shelley. I appreciate that. That some people would have, why might they have the opposite reaction? I agree with you. There are some people that are going to want to assimilate.
Well, they'd see it as survival.
Okay, they may say, that the assimilators are going to be surviving. Maybe there are going to be some, particularly the ones who are most knowledgeable of what they left behind, that want to celebrate, keep that culture alive. And that becomes their focus, including maybe an anticipation that one day, what?
They'd be able to go back.
They may be able to go back. So, and especially if they could keep that vision, and especially the leadership, if they could keep the people that have been put in exile, if they could keep that vision that, we've got to maintain our culture. We've got to maintain it. Because one day we're going to go home. We're going to have the opportunity to go home. And if we lose it, we're not going to take anything back with us. So we need to maintain that culture. We don't want to be part of a melting pot. We want to keep ourselves distinct. Okay? And that would certainly appear to be the perspective of the writer. That's a good thing, that you want to keep that they kept their culture together, because their culture is more than just a culture.
It's faith.
It involves faith. Faith in
God. Worship
God. That God that has the
Correct.
4 letters, 4-letter name. So this is more than, at least from the perspective of the writer, the God who tells you how to worship. Now, for these exiles, what's the problem with worship?
You don't have any place.
You can't do it.
Yeah. No place to go.
You can't worship God in Babylon. You can't do it. In fact, there are psalms, about exile psalms that talk about how can we worship the Lord in a foreign land. Well, we can't.
No temple.
Because, it's we Protestants and Christians believe, well, you can be a Christian anywhere. Well, not if you can only sacrifice, if part of being a Christian is making animal sacrifices that you can do in only one place that has now been torn down and it ain't where you live. How do you worship God when that's how you worship God? That becomes a huge, huge problem. And so the anticipation of coming home becomes really, really important. Now there's going to be another anticipation that people are going to start thinking about. Because when Judah ends up, and it's not going to be so much in Ezra and Nehemiah, but we're going to see it in some of the minor prophets, particularly Haggai and Zephaniah. They're going to start looking, what's the other thing they lost? They lost their land and the temple and everything associated. What else did they leave when they were taken into exile? That will become, like I said, it's not important in Ezra and Nehemiah because worship is important. Worship is just like in the book of the Kings. But what else did the people of Judah lose when Jerusalem fell?
God was not in that.
Well, God was gone, and they lost the place to connect to God. But remember, I told you that the ancient Jews tended to see 3 symbols, three ways to demonstrate that they could know. They could look at it and say, God is with us. We could look at these 3 things and man, we know God is with us. And one of them was certainly the land sort of focused on Jerusalem, focused on the temple. That was one thing. The other thing was the law. We've got this law that we really haven't heard much except for worship law. We really haven't heard much in the story. We hear that a lot later, like in the New Testament. What's the other thing that the Jews... So they could look at the law. As long as I've got the law, I know God is with me. As long as I've got a temple to worship Him, I know God is with me. And as long as I have what?
His protection?
Yeah, in a sense.
Everything being torn down.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, well,
I'm trying to
it is kind of pretty. As long as we got a king, a king in the line of
got it.
David. As long as we've got a Davidic king, we know, because that's also a theme in the book of the books of the Kings. That Judah had the Davidic king. Now that takes a second seat, a back seat to worship. In the book of the Kings, everything is about where you worship, how you worship, when you worship. It's all about worship here and who you don't worship. But the idea that there's a Davidic king in Jerusalem, that becomes this sign. The promises made to David. David becomes this example. You got a Davidic king in Jerusalem. As long as you got a Davidic king, then you know God is with you. So not only do we start seeing this anticipation of going home, but we start seeing, again, not in Ezra and Nehemiah, but in other places, other people writing at the same time, this work is being produced. We start seeing people doing what? Related to a Davidic king.
They put their hope into their king,
Okay,
not their God.
they start
They do
anticipating.
with Saul.
They start anticipating that there's going to be a Davidic king coming. And that Davidic king coming, when God restores the Davidic king, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when God restores the Davidic king? In fact, what does God have to do if he's restoring the Davidic king?
Come back.
He's got to be restoring the kingdom. So God is going to restore the kingdom when the Davidic king. And as they anticipate this coming Davidic king, how would you and we're not talking about over months or years, we're talking about over centuries. How are they going to start anticipating? What attributes are they going to give this king that they have anticipated for 400 years? You think he's just going to be a regular guy?
Are you talking about the prophecies?
Well, I'm talking about the expectations of the people. Are they going to be high? Are they going to be low? Is this just going to be another one even like Hezekiah, who was a great king, but another Hezekiah? Is that what they're going to anticipate? Heck no. This king is going to not only restore the kingdom, but going to restore the kingdom in glory. It's not going to be a little vassal state shoved into a corner. This is going to be central. So when God brings this divinity, his kingdom is going to be restored. And all of that expectation is going to be built. Now, like I said, that you can't squeeze that into Ezra and Nehemiah because it's just not there. That's not where this writer sees. But other writers do. And that becomes really important when you look at places like Isaiah, particularly after the 40th chapter. That becomes part of because that's much later than earlier. That becomes a big part of the expectation. And even a lot of the minor prophets. Like I said, Zephaniah is a big one. Haggai is a big one. In fact, they believe they found him. They believe he's come back. Now, and we'll see his name in what we're looking at today. Of course, he didn't. But they say the great king has returned, and this is his name. And that's what they say. But of course, he kind of fades into history, and you don't hear anything about him later. But that becomes more and more an expectation, and that's what we see bleeding into the New Testament. This idea. And of course, every king was called. What was the title every king carried? Every single king that sat on the throne in Judah was called Christos. In Greek, was called Christos. Was called Messiah in Hebrew. Because that's what they were. They had the oil poured on them. And so the expectation is the coming Christos, the coming Messiah, Lord have mercy. He is going to clean the slate. He is going to restore God's rule. And it's going to be in almost a cosmic way. And then you start associating that with the resurrection, the general resurrection. You get this incredibly powerful image. And that's what we see, that establishes Christ as the Messiah. Becomes that figure that the Jews expect to come and liberate. Okay, anyway, that's so almost like a little aside. I hadn't even intended to talk about it because this is not an issue in Ezra. We won't see that at all.
I'm glad you did.
Well, because it's floating around,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's really tempting, and it's unfortunate because this isn't how Scripture was written. That we read the Bible like Muslims read the Quran, and Muslims read the Quran. It was all written by one person who took God's dictation. So everything is related to everything else. And it is one work written by one person. Well, okay. The Jews didn't view that about the Bible. Christians have never viewed that about the Bible. We know a lot of different people wrote it. And over a lot of different times dealing with a lot of different things. And therefore, some writers focus on one thing and another writer focuses on something else. And sometimes they don't fit together real neat. People who put it together under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, they weren't stupid. They were aware of that these two things didn't fit together, but they believed that both were necessary. We needed to hear both of them. And so we have these ideas floating around in the ancient world. And you also have, the law, the moral law. That's what the Pharisees, that's what they were all about later. Following the ethical law, not the worship law. Okay, so anyway, we're here. So Babylon has taken the people. We see a change, because remember I told you one of the realities in Mesopotamia and in Egypt is you have these civilizations that are at war with other civilizations. And you had the Assyrians who conquered Israel, and then they were destroyed by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians have a real short run, because in the 6th century BC, they are replaced. They only are really dominant for maybe less than 100 years, and then they are overwhelmed by the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. And that's where we pick up Ezra. So the Persians are not the ones. The rulers at the beginning of Ezra are not the people, the rulers that took the Israelites or the people from Judah into captivity. It's a different people. They've been conquered. Babylon has been conquered. Okay, so we're at verse 1 of Ezra. Who is mentioned right at the beginning of Ezra?
Cyrus.
Okay, we got Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, we hadn't even heard about the Persians. We didn't hear about them in 2 Kings because they weren't a player. But not only are they a player, but they are the player. And Cyrus is going to conquer Babylon somewhere around 35, 38. And when I'm going to give you BC, when I'm going to give you dates, as the number gets smaller, we get more recent, because it kind of goes backwards. BC numbers go the other way, So for the year 400 BC is after the year 500 BC, because we're moving up to the year 1. Yeah, I mean, there's no year 0, but we're kind of moving in that direction. We hit that point, and then we go, the other way. Yeah. So just to be aware, sometimes that gets a little confusing. Okay, so King Cyrus, and this would have been soon after. By other historical records, not just this, but other historical records. This would have been soon after he conquers Babylon, because he conquers Babylon in 537 BC. So he is now the ruler of everything worth ruling. I mean, he's the king of the world. Now, the writer says something about what motivates, which tells us immediately the perspective of the writer. What motivates Cyrus to act?
The Lord.
Boom, that's all you have to say. The Lord.
Yep.
Who's still in control of the story?
The Lord.
God's in control of the story. And in fact, what God is going to do is going to fulfill prophecy that Jeremiah said. And one of the things Jeremiah says is that, because he predicted, poor Jeremiah, he had it really rough. We heard about Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem. You know who was there? Jeremiah. Jeremiah was in the city. Jeremiah was an advisor to Zedekiah, who told him, bad things are going to happen. And Zedekiah said, the heck with that. I'll listen to all these guys that are telling me what I want to hear. Which is a problem of being surrounded by people who only tell you what you want to hear. Because that's what Zedekiah, and Jeremiah was saying, you got to straighten up or God's going to abandon you. And Zedekiah says, I got 100 people to say you're wrong. And so Jeremiah is out in the cold. And so he's there in Jerusalem when it falls. And poor Jeremiah, Jerusalem falls. And people are eating pets. They're eating anything they can get their hands on in Jerusalem, because they're starving to death as a result of this siege. And all of a sudden, and then all the 100 people that said to Zedekiah, don't worry, God's going to take it. He's not going to let you down. Don't worry about it. He's going to help you. And Jeremiah's saying, no, he won't. You're going to watch it. And so finally, these guys are saying to Zedekiah, your goose is cooked. You're in big trouble. And remember in the story, Zedekiah tries to escape, with an army. They say, you got to get out of here because God's giving you up. You know what message the Lord told Jeremiah to start preaching? It's crazy. The Lord, because Jeremiah is an angry prophet. He's not a happy guy. Jeremiah is really angry. And he preaches this message and he prays to God. God, I've been preaching this horrible message. Nothing bad has happened. Come down on your people. Just wipe them out. And then at least I have the satisfaction of knowing, I could say, I told you so. I could say, yeah, I told you so. God wouldn't do it. Year after year after year. And people were laughing at him, pushing him around because he's got the one message that's negative. And as soon as everybody is going up to Jeremiah and saying, Jeremiah, you were right. We should have listened to you. Oh my goodness, things are really bad. God doesn't even want him to say, I told you. You know what God wants him to say? Put on a happy face. Things are going to get better. And people are saying, you're nuts. We're eating anything we can eat, and you're telling us to be happy. Well, God's going to restore. He's going to restore Judah. That's what Jeremiah says. And that's what it refers here, fulfilling the word of Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah ended up at the end of his ministry saying, once things got so bad, he said, yeah, but it's going to get better. In fact, God tells him to buy property in Jerusalem before they ship the people out. Talk about a bad investment. But that was a symbol. You had hope. That becomes at the end hope. Of course, poor Jeremiah gets kidnapped and drug off to Egypt. So it wasn't good for Jeremiah. But that's when he says the word of Jeremiah. That's what he's talking about. And what does the Lord... But the Lord is behind this, right? What does the Lord end up doing? What does the Lord do? And we're going to take big hunks of stuff because I've diddled around with other things for a while. So as we go through, but we can't. What does the Lord say? What does the Lord do through King Cyrus? Okay, boom. He issues an edict, right? That you can now go home. You can to the Jews. You can now go home. And that's what he permits. And how should, not only will they can go home, but when you get home, this is the king of the world now. Cyrus, the great emperor, Cyrus the Great. When you get home, how should the people treat you when you get home? How should you be treated?
You should help them out.
Oh, they should be helping you out. Now, as the writer writes this decree, who's prominent in this decree? Why is Cyrus doing this? Even using Cyrus's words, why is he doing it? The Lord. That's all you need to say. The Lord is in this decree. Almost as though the Lord is whispered in Cyrus's ear as he's writing it down. So the Lord is in control of this. Cyrus is sending him home. Okay, so the people now this establishment is going to go home. And how did the people respond? And the writer tells us what people we're talking about, right? What people are we talking about? Who is going home? Well, depends on how you define Jew, right? What is a Jew by the writer's definition?
Judah and Benjamin.
That's it. Jews are from Judah and Benjamin. Well, Judah and Benjamin. Geez, I'm thinking of, and Levi, because you need Levites. But geez, there were some other tribes, right? Are they mentioned? Ephraim, Issachar, Dan, Naphtali, Manasseh? No. They were the first group. The people from the nation of Israel that the Assyrians showed. They aren't mentioned here at all. At It's the people from Judah and Benjamin, the tribes of the southern kingdom. The one that was centered around Jerusalem. That's what we're talking about here. So it's really, we don't want to talk about the Israelites coming back, because they aren't. This is the people of Judah coming home. But those are the people that are important, because they're the ones that came closest to doing what God wanted them to do, and that is what? Worship in Jerusalem at the temple. Okay, so they're going to go home. The people are supposed to support them. And what are they going to do when they get home? They're going to build the temple. And that's why you just don't need people from Judah and Benjamin to go. You also need what? You can't just have people from Judah and Benjamin go back. Who else do you need? You gotta have.
Craftsmen.
Well, true, but even more fundamental than craftsmen. In fact, the craftsmen are going to be drawn from these people. You got to have Levites. You got to have Levites, because they're building the temple. And in fact, the craftsmen are going to be Levites, because they're dealing with the holy things of God. So you got to have Levites, and if you're building a temple, you also need priests who are also Levites. You don't have priests from Benjamin or Judah. The priests are from Levi. Okay, and they're going to be assisted, but they're going to rebuild the temple. Why do they need to rebuild the temple? Because you can't worship God any other way. So they're going to have to rebuild the temple. And what does even Cyrus do as he's sending these people home?
Gives them silver and stuff.
Okay, Cyrus gives them silver. And in particular, what stuff does he pack into their bags?
He took the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar took out.
Yeah, the stuff that the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, took out of the temple. When he stripped the temple down, he had like a little museum, I'm sure, of places he took from, stuff he took from conquered people. So people could go and see his power and glory. The stuff from the temple would have been there, and King Cyrus is going to take that and send him home. Now, there's a practical reason why he would want to do this. Certainly the writer sees this is God doing it. There's also a practical reason. I mean, the only benefit he's going to get from this province is taxes. Controlling land is a big pain. It has to be maintained unless you're getting something out of it. And if you take the best and the brightest out of an area, that area is not going to be all that productive. So, and if you bring other people in who really don't care that much about it, easy to control, but they're not fired up about making this a great place. They don't care. It makes sense. And that's what the Persians are going to tend to do. The Assyrians and the Babylonians ship people out. What the Persians tended to do, again, good economic reasons, is they tended to ship people back. So people would feel pride. Pride in their land. Good Persian citizens, taking pride in your home, working together in empire. That's one of the things. The Persians were real big on that. Romans are going to do the same sort of thing in their empire. So makes peoples get along. As long as you respect one another, things will be fine. Okay, so the people are heading home. The first thing they need to do is, they need to get a place to worship God. And as we move into the second chapter, so by the end of the first chapter, we got people heading home. And according to chapter 2, how are the people that return home, how are they described? How are these people described?
Exiles?
What's that?
Exiles?
Exiles, right. They were taken by Nebuchadnezzar, almost like he wants to inject a little history here, So they're coming back, and where do they go, these people that are coming back? What does the writer tell us? They go to their hometowns. They go to where they were before. Now, this isn't a long time. We're talking like 70 years, but that's for us, that's a while. But For them, it evidently wasn't, so they still have a sense of what is their home. Who comes with them? Some names that will be important, particularly 3 names right at the beginning that are important. The first one is Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel, he's going to be the sort of the Roman governor. Not Roman, the Persian governor. The Persians are not stupid. Instead of sending a Persian to be governor, they tend to appoint native people in the area to be the governor. Then maybe you'll prevent some disruption. Zerubbabel is going to be a Jew that's going to be appointed governor by the Persians, and he's the one that some of like Zephaniah and Hagar, they're going to see him as the Messiah. They're going to believe he's going to be the one to reestablish Judah. And he's governor for a while and then just disappears. History doesn't know what happened to him. He just kind of vanishes, which means he did his job, died, was fired, got a watch, don't know. He doesn't become the Messiah that restores Jerusalem. Okay, so Zerubbabel is there. Who else? Joshua is, and he's going to be priest. And then the last one, Nehemiah. We'll talk about Nehemiah in a little bit. Now, a lot of details about the people returning, right? And we got priests, and we've got craftsmen, and we got all this kind of stuff. Now, why is there so many details?
Because of all the stuff that was taken from the original.
Okay, so we got a lot of stuff taken, so details about it coming back.
Yes.
Okay, what about the people, with the people? Good gracious, all these names, Lordy. There's a lot of names here.
I didn't read them all.
Great. I didn't either. Why all these names? And numbers. Good night, numbers. Why? Remember, unlike me at my computer, where I can put in 10,000 words and it costs me, everything they write is expensive. Because they're writing it on papyrus, for crying out loud. So you cannot afford to waste space. And yet the writer here chooses to put tons of names and tons of numbers in some and that we don't. Shelley, you didn't read it. I didn't read it. If you read it, God bless you. You may get a jewel in your crown later. I don't know why you did. Why would he do this? These are names that only a mother could care about.
But they're descendants from the original people.
Okay, descendants from the original people, so it links it with the past. What else does it show? What else might it demonstrate? What does it suggest about the return?
That they have a lot of stuff.
They got a lot of stuff and a lot of people. You got a lot of people coming home. So it's not like 25 folks that are coming. Yeah. We got a massive, and that's what the writer wants to illustrate. We've got a people
this
coming home.
The numbers of the people from each family?
Yeah. Jeez Louise.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. Yes.
That's some reunion.
Yes. Well, what does it show? It shows a nation is coming back. A nation is moving. And in fact, you've not only got a nation moving, but there's a lot of detail about who else is coming. So we got a ton of people coming back. Who else is singled out? You got a bunch of priests coming back, right? All these priests. Well, why do we need all these priests?
That's what I was going to say. How do you know which certain priests did you have to go to talk to?
Well, what is he doesn't say.
Yeah.
So why, it would make sense if he said, now these are important because, why is he doing this? Why is the writer taking so much space to write stuff that seems to be, for us, incidental at best, maybe downright boring? Why would he do that?
So you have an idea of how many people?
Okay, they got an idea of how many people and how important the priests are. You know, the importance that he's putting on the priests and the importance he wants his reader to put on the priests. And in fact, some of the priests, in fact, the last group in verse 61, we got a little family of priests. What's their issue? You know, all these other priests are coming home. We got a group in verse 61 that's singled out.
The to who the descendants of them are.
Yeah, what's the problem with this little family?
They had intermarried.
Yeah, they'd intermarried and they didn't have, it wasn't in the genealogy anymore. So, therefore,
They couldn't marry? Is that
They weren't-
They were unclean.
they weren't clean, which means they couldn't be priests. And in fact, they talk about testing them. You know, going to the Urim and Thummim, which are two. Have you ever seen those old? I know you have. The 8 balls. Those old 8 balls, which would tell your future.
Yes.
You shake them out,
Yes.
and you tell your future.
Yes.
Or the little things that we made in school, girls in particular.
Oh,
That you did that and you open it and it would tell you your future. That was kind of what these were. In a way, they were on the priest's ephod, on the chest plate that the priest wore. These two little, I don't want to even call them stones because they weren't really stones. They had a yes and no on it, on these stones. And they would use that to make decisions. Because they believed God would speak through these stones.
They'd like throw them or something?
That's what they do.
Probably.
And if yes came up,
That was what you were supposed
will
to
of
do.
God. Had to be random. Because God would control that. If they controlled it, that means they would go. And that's what. So but that's what the Jews believe, man. That's all the way back in Leviticus. These stones as a way to determine what is the will of God. And this little group, this little family has to go to the priests to determine if they qualify as priests anymore. What does that, the fact, again, that he includes this, what does that show about the people that are returning? What does it show about them and their desire?
To walk straight with God.
They want to be straight with God. They want to make sure T's are crossed and I's are dotted. How does that compare with the people that were there before? The people in 2 Kings.
They weren't too good.
They weren't so good. Yeah, that wasn't a priority for them. But it is for these people that are coming home. And again, as we read this, we are almost pounded with it. In a sense, these folks are a whole lot more like the people that entered the promised land under Joshua than they are the people Moses had to deal with in the wilderness. Or the people that Joash or Hezekiah had to deal with in Judah. You know, these people are exemplary. You know, they do things right because they do things what? God's way. God does it God's way. And in fact, when the whole assembly gathers, and we've got a ton of people, right? They all gather, they got all their stuff and all this detail, and it's a big group. What do?
Going home.
Yeah, when they get home, this huge assembly of people, what would these people do?
And go to their own homes or build a home.
Well, you think
To live.
that would make sense. If it said they went to their own home and started to plant crops and start building houses and establishing them, we'd say, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's not what they did. What did this whole assembly do? Thousands of people. Of course they go to Jerusalem. The temple's not there anymore because remember the Babylonians tore it down. They go to where the temple used to be, and what do?
Rebuild it.
Before they do anything else, they start performing sacrifices. What does that show about the people that are coming back? These guys are...
Their faith is still strong.
They are really strong. I mean, what you said, I think we would assume, of course, you go home, you establish yourself. That's not what they do first. They got to sacrifice to the Lord in the place where the Lord
Lives.
wants us to sacrifice. So they are going to do that. And in fact, as they're there sacrificing, what do they give? They give their silver, they give their gold, they give everything they got in order to rebuild this temple. This temple has got to be rebuilt. Now, what happens as we get into chapter 3? What do we have? What's the scene as we get to chapter 3?
They're building the altar.
Well, chapter 3, we got now we got Israelites, so now this idea of Judah and Israel has sort of melded a little bit, because we haven't seen the exile of the northern tribes at all. We only have talked about the 2 southern tribes.
Assembles as one man.
Okay, they gather in Jerusalem, and the priest, Joshua, what does he start to do? Man, what is the first thing, if you're a priest, you got to do?
They began to build the altar.
You got to build an altar. Why do you have to have an altar?
Because you can make sacrifices.
You got to have altars have one function alone. One function alone. Altars are for sacrifices. Period. Close the book. That's the only function an altar has.
Okay, when they made it, this was in the temple, on the altar, and they made the sacrifices. Did they actually burn them on that altar in the temple?
The altar where the sacrifices were performed in the old temple that they tore down was not in the building. The altar was not in the building. The altar was outside the building. And it was like an assembly line. That's why you needed a whole bunch of priests. It was like an assembly line. But yeah, the altar was on the outside of the building. It must have been huge, because they were performing sacrifices 24/7. It was, and just imagine, we're talking about slaughtering animals all day long. That must have been an intense place to be around.
Well, that's why
Not particularly pleasant place to be around, but that's what they did. I mean, and so the priest, once they get to Jerusalem, that's the first thing he's got to build. He's got to build an altar, because you need it to perform a sacrifice. That's why, churches, Roman Catholics have altars. It's appropriate for Roman Catholic to have an altar, because every time the Mass is celebrated, the sacrifice of Jesus is repeated. Therefore, you need an altar to do it. Protestants don't need altars, because we don't believe that Jesus is constantly sacrificed again. What a lot of Protestants call altars are table things, because altars are only for sacrifice. That's what an altar is. It's for sacrifice. So anyway,
How about when we perform the sacrament of communion?
Well, see, Protestants don't believe that when we celebrate communion, Roman Catholics believe when they celebrate the Mass that they are consuming the actual flesh and blood of Christ, because Jesus has been sacrificed again as the priest goes through the ritual. So the death, Christ in a sense dies again.
Oh.
And the sacrifice is continually made. And therefore through that the elements change. And so you actually consume Christ. In fact, one of the things that the Romans made Christians unpopular with the Romans. But again, if you don't read, if there's nothing to read, and you talk about what do you feel in your heart, that's irrelevant. So you have these rituals What does it mean to be a Christian? Well, it means being close to Christ. Well, how do I be close to Christ? Well, feel it in your heart. That doesn't mean anything to me. I'm working. Here, you perform the sacrifice. This will make you feel closer to Christ. Okay. So it develops kind of in that world. Roman Catholic would believe that Jesus is sacrificed every time the priest performs the Mass. And the elements actually, they're not their spiritual nature, that's what Luther said, but their physical nature changes as a result of the words. And when they're placed on the altar, which is where the sacrifice is performed, it is no longer bread and juice. It is real flesh and blood. And that's why they'll talk about chewing the flesh and drinking the blood. And it's interesting. That's one of the reasons before Constantine in the Roman Empire converts in the 4th century. That was one of the criticisms that the pagans had against Christians. There was a reputation that Christians were cannibals because they were eating flesh and drinking blood in their rituals. And Christians said, yeah, we are. And so the Romans said, you're eating people. That's worse than performing human sacrifice. That's performing human sacrifice and then eating the person you sacrifice. That's horrible. And that was one of the things the Romans accused the Christians of doing. The Christians weren't doing it, of course, but that's what the Romans used to sort of denigrate, to put down Christians, is that they were cannibals. This was a cult of cannibals, eating flesh and drinking blood.
I thought they made the physical sacrifice, but then later the meat stuff was cooked.
Well, that was the animal sacrifice.
Yeah.
The Romans were accusing. The Romans would say, look, we do animal sacrifice. We sacrifice, sheep and oxen and doves. We perform animal sacrifices. Christians are eating human flesh and drinking human blood. We don't do that. That's disgusting. So there were two things the Romans said about Christians. One, their worship rituals were disgusting. And second, they weren't good patriots. Because they wouldn't participate in civic activities where you sacrificed to all the gods and then had a barbecue. Christians wouldn't participate in it. And that made you a bad Roman citizen. So that's what the Romans said. But that changed, of course, when Constantine changed. So, but that's these guys, that's what they've got to do. But they're not even going to stop there. What else are they going to do? They build this altar so you can have sacrifices. What do they instigate? Celebration. They're having celebrations. And in fact, they're starting to celebrate all kinds of festivals. Where are these festivals coming from? It's in Scripture. It's in Levitical. It's in the Levitical law. So they are celebrating the festivals. Now, what does that? We went through the whole book of Kings, both books of Kings, and how many Passovers did we celebrate? One stupid Passover, and that was a big deal. That hadn't been done for. What are they doing? They're doing the festival of the booths, for crying out loud. They're doing new moon festivals.
Of the moon. Oh.
Yeah, they're doing all kinds of festivals that are in Scripture, have been reinstituted. Now, if worship is your thing, if you are really fired up about worship, and that's how you show you're close to God, are these people close to God?
Not at the sun.
Lord, have mercy, they're close. They're doing everything that the law tells them to do. They're not just fiddling around with, building a temple. They are doing everything the law is telling them to do. But the writer reminds us that what hasn't been laid yet?
The foundation for the...
We don't have a temple yet, but we do have an altar. So the altar the altar, of course, is where it's supposed to be. You just don't have a temple anymore. Now, according to verse 8, what begins to happen? What do they start doing in verse 8? Now they're going to start building the temple. And how is the building described? How is the building process described? Which is fascinating how it's described. They're building the temple. How is it described? Because you got workmen doing their thing. Because you got to cut stone. You got to have timber. How is this building described? Remember, we're talking the writer. How do you think the writer wants us to see these people?
Being joyful.
Being joyful, being faithful, being dedicated, being as Jewish as you can possibly be, right? I mean, that's what he wants. That's how he's writing this. They are going like nobody has ever done. They're doing it. So they're building the temple, right? You got people laying bricks. You got carpenters cutting wood. But they're not the only ones involved in building. Who else is there on the job site? Having worked construction many years ago, this never was the case in any construction site I had ever been on. What else was going on as the temple was being built?
The priest and his sons were working on it.
Yeah, we're working on it. And what else were they doing?
Celebrating.
They were celebrating. They were singing. They were playing instruments. They were reading Psalms. That's where there's mention of David in there. So we're talking about Davidic Psalms. So as the workers, now on job sites there was always somebody with a radio. So we had music, but it was a little different. They are praising God. And in fact, it is such a powerful experience. What else is happening?
There's weeping.
There are people who are crying as the temple is going up.
And you can't hear them because of all the noise.
Yeah, and that's all blending in to this sound. To this point, how is the return been presented? By the time we get to the end of chapter 3.
It's good.
Oh, it's glorious. It's good. We got something, and we'll cover this quickly. We got something introduced in chapter 4. What is introduced for the first time in chapter 4?
Opposition to the
We have opposition. And who are, and it's interesting, the opposition, and we know their opposition because he calls them enemies. I mean, the writer tells us how we're supposed to feel because what the enemies do doesn't sound all that bad, right? By the way, who are these people that are saying this? Who are the people? Who are these adversaries?
enemies of Judah and Benjamin.
They're enemies of Judah and Benjamin. From where are they?
Assyria.
What's that?
Assyria.
Well, they're probably the people who are still in the land. Because remember, the exiles have come home. But they didn't come home to a land that had 0 people in it. Because that's not the way the Assyrians or the Babylonians work. They just moved populations around. Primarily the high class. So when they moved this high class, this power moved in when they were allowed to go home. And we assume that the power base in whoever the Babylonians moved into Judah, they also were allowed to go home. Were allowed to leave. The people who were in the land, they weren't all that thrilled about having a new power group move in. Because their lives weren't going to get any better. Right? In fact, some of the people that were moved out, I imagine some of these really poor folks at the bottom may have been a little glad that the guy who owned the land you worked had now been shipped out of town, and who shows up? His grandson, and says, well, we're going to take the land back. So the people who are working it probably aren't doing cartwheels to have the old establishment back. Now, but the writer tells us that they are enemies. So we're not to view them sympathetically, right? If he wanted us to view him sympathetically, he wouldn't have said that. We're supposed to see him as hostile, and we know how wonderful these folks are, right? What do these people want to do?
Help build your temple.
Yeah, we're here. Let us rebuild the temple. And in fact, they even say, we can do it because in the temple you're going to be doing what?
Sacrifices.
Worshipping the same God we worship. Because that's what the Assyrians let us do. Right there, what's the problem? If they say we've been worshiping God, we've been worshiping that God every day since you've been gone, the Assyrians let us do it.
It's not the same God.
It's not the same God because they can't because the temple has been destroyed. And there ain't any altars on the temple. So they aren't doing it. Remember we said that about Israel. The problem in Israel wasn't that they weren't worshiping the Lord God, because they were. The problem was they were worshiping the Lord God.
Their way.
Yeah, in Dan and Bethel, in places you're not supposed to do that. So you couldn't be worshiped. It doesn't matter what you name him. The name is irrelevant. It's how you worship him. So these people could not be doing that. We also get the idea that there might be some, else going on underneath, since they're enemies. And what do the returnees do? Zerubbabel. And this may be one reason why they start thinking Zerubbabel may be the Messiah, because he's Jewish. And we'll find out, we see in other places, that he's a descendant of David. He's in the Davidic line. What does Zerubbabel?
He tells them they're going to have no part of it.
Can't do it. Now that's really interesting, because it shows us how these people, and certainly the writer, views the faith. This is not a faith that's looking for converts.
Did they think they were going to be able to worship their God in the Christian God's temple?
Well, and understand their God has the same name. It's the same name. But it's not because you can't be, because you weren't worshiping him. You can't worship him without a temple. And I don't see an altar up there. So we had to build one. So you weren't doing it the way you're supposed to, which means you weren't following God's law. Therefore, it's idolatry, just like all the kings of Israel and Judah did. They are just as idolatry. They are following the old way. That's the way it used to be done. And Zerubbabel says this is a new day. We're not going to bring that old stuff back in. Now, also kind of shows that, and this is what Jews later, and to a certain extent Christians later, are going to tend to do, is going to be sort of almost insular. This is our community. And we're going to be real skeptical of people on the outside. Because people on the outside are outsiders. And they say things and do things that we don't like. And maybe they should stay on the outside. Yeah, maybe they should stay.
That's not being very Christian.
Well, no, but sometimes Christians do that. Sometimes we do that. This is the way we do it. And if you want to join us, then you better learn how we do things, because we ain't going to change. Not for you. So you're just going to have to learn our way, because our way is
The right way.
the right way. And if you don't want to, fine. We don't judge you. But maybe you want to find some place where you're more comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay, so we see this, but that's not viewed as a negative here. This is viewed as a positive. And in fact, what do these opponents end up doing? Which everybody knows is wrong. What do these opponents end up doing?
He tried to discourage the people, Jews, and make them afraid.
Yeah, they tried to discourage the people from Judah. So they put obstacles. We're going to see more about that with Nehemiah a little bit later. And in fact, what do they end up writing? They end up writing a letter. Now, important to understand, this letter is about 100 years after the people have returned. Because Artaxerxes reigned about 100 years after Cyrus. So it's been a long time. They've been in the land a long time. Or we would think a long time. But it's 100 years later. And they write, and whether it could be, it says, it uses that name, but it may refer to his dad, who was named Xerxes. But be that as it may, they write a letter. And what do they say in the letter? So they write a letter to the Persian emperor, right? Mm-hmm. And understand, Judah, it's a time, this is way out. If you look at a map of the empire, this is way in a corner off to the side. It's not like it's in the center. It's just on the edge. Now, the Babylonians have conquered Egypt. So Egypt is part, not Babylon. The Persians have conquered Egypt. So Egypt is part of this greater Persian empire. So it's a powerful, and they're moving into Greece, and it's a powerful place. All the way to the Indus River. I mean, it's huge, this empire. They write, so this is a backwater of the empire. They write the emperor and say what to him?
They're telling him that the Jews are building a rebellious and bad city, and they've drawn walls, making them very strong, and they're no longer going to pay in taxes.
Now, Jews have always been troublemakers.
So they say.
They've always been troublemakers. And they are building a place to worship, which is going to galvanize people, going to unite them, going to build walls. And as soon as they do that, and the emperor says, I don't care. Then they hit something he does care about. And what does it say? What's in the letter that the emperor's that's going to pique the emperor's interest? They're going to stop doing what?
Pay taxes.
Paying taxes. They're going to stop paying taxes because they look at the record. They are constantly rebelling. And they are going to be, you let them keep on doing this, they're going to be a thorn in your side. And they write the letter, and what does the king do?
He writes them letters back.
Okay, he writes them a letter back. And what has he done in between the two letters?
Told him to stop.
Well, that's what he says to him. But in between the two letters, he goes to the library and looks up in the Dewey Decimal Judah and got a book on Judah and read. And he says, oh my gosh, they really are as troublesome as these guys say they are. Their history is dotted with rebellions and stuff. And so they are right. We got to shut these guys down. And what does he tell the Jews to do? You got to stop working. You got to stop working. And do the Jews stop working? And it's almost like he says, and it's to the people that sent the original letters. Well, I'm going to give you authority to make sure they do it. They stop. And do the Jews stop?
Yes.
You don't do, and they stop. Do they start again? You don't toot and they do, but when do they start again?
New king.
When you got a new king. And so we can expect a new story with Darius, this new king. So, but they do stop. Now, as we look at this, the beginning, who is driving this story? Who is God is still driving the story. What may be a fundamental difference between the story? So in the book of Kings, we've got God driving the story. We got in the book of Ezra, we got God driving the story. He's behind it all. What might be some of the differences between what we've been looking at in the books of the Kings and what we're looking at now that may also help us understand what we will see as this story transpires? What are some differences or some similarities, some differences, but
You're obeying God.
what's good? They're obeying God. We got a people that are obeying God. And there's no king, So it's the people that are obeying God, but they're doing it through the priest. The way they obey God, though, is exactly the same. How do you obey God?
Worship the prophets.
You worship. How do you worship?
The temple.
You got to have a temple. You got to have an altar. You got to celebrate the special days. Again, we got no mention of. You got to treat one another kindly, because that's not an emphasis of the writer. That's not what he's saying. Now understand, you got all these prophets. That's all they're saying. In fact, you got Amos that says, God doesn't care how you worship. That's crazy in the Amos. Amos says, God didn't care how you worship. He didn't care. You know what he wants? He wants justice to flow down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That's what he wants. He doesn't care about your sacrifices. That's what he wants. If the writer of the Kings and Ezra met Amos, what would he say to Amos? You're wrong. You're wrong. God does care how you worship. God does care where the sacrifices are performed. Which means we've got this wonderful book that you've got people moving and emphasizing different things. So it reminds us that maybe, what a radical thought, maybe both are important. Maybe. Because Amos says this and the writer of Kings says this. Maybe they're both important. Maybe. Okay, next week, we're going to continue through on into Ezra. We're going to look at chapter 5, 1 through 622. 5:1 through 622. And there's been a person absent through these first 4 chapters of Ezra. Do you happen to know what person has been absent through these first 4 chapters of Ezra?
Peg and her husband.
Oh, yeah, Peg and Van. I'm thinking of in the book.
Oh.
In the first 4 chapters of this book, who's been absent?
King.
Yeah, no, yes, right. No king.
Priest.
Well, we've had a lot of priests. And we did have a governor. Zerubbabel is governor. We did have a priest who's been... There's somebody that's been missing in these first 4 chapters that would seem to be pretty important in the book of Ezra. Ezra's been absent. We haven't seen Ezra yet. He will appear in chapter 5. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for guiding us through this. Remind us that dedication takes a lot of different forms and they're not mutually exclusive. So help us to take them all seriously. Help us to recognize that you really want us to approach you in a certain way. But you also want us to approach one another in a certain way. So when Jesus says love you and love our neighbors, maybe we need to take them both seriously. Help us to do that. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you.